They said he wasn't getting the job done. Strange, considering he spent over 2 decades training pastors, writing the Hebrew materials others still quietly rely on, and laboring to help men know and preach the Word of God. Dr. Russell Fuller wasn't fired for failure. He was dismissed for faithfulness. He saw what many didn't, or wouldn't. He spoke up when it was costly, and he stood alone, exposing what had crept into the heart of a once trusted institution: critical race theory in the classroom, postmodernism in the pulpit, and compromise at the highest levels. He wasn't a troublemaker, he was a watchman. Now, this isn't just his story. It's a call to every man who names the name of Christ. In a time of soft words and shifting sand, will you stand on truth even when it costs you? 1 Corinthians 16:13 says, "Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong." And so, join us as we build, fight, protect, and lead. This is the Patriarch.
Rise up, O men of God, have done with lesser.
Rise up, O men of God, have done with lesser things. Give heart and mind, soul and strength, and serve the King of Kings. Lift high the cross of Christ, tread where his feet have trod. As brothers of the Son of Man, rise up, O men of God.
Preach the word, be ready in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, exhort with great patience and instruction. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine. That was 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. And I am Pastor Joseph Spurgeon. And you are listening to the Patriarchy Podcast, a ministry of Sovereign King Church. Faithfulness always comes at a cost. Today, I am joined by Dr. Russell Fuller, a man who didn't chase popularity but stood for truth when others compromised. And we'll talk about the fallout, the faithfulness, and how you can stand firm when it feels like everyone else is giving in. And so please join me in welcome Dr. Fuller to the Patriarchy Podcast. It's good to have you with us.
Well, thanks. It's good to be with you, Joseph.
Dr. Fuller, I didn't have you as a professor at Southern, so I went to Southern from about 2011. And by Southern, maybe I should introduce you a little bit more. You were a professor at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And so that's in Louisville, Kentucky, near where I live. And so I went there from the year 2011 to 2016. But even though I didn't have you, as I was just telling you off camera, I feel like I know you because my Hebrew professor used your material. Like we watched your videos, we read your textbooks. And so even from a distance, you kind of shaped my understanding of Hebrew. When you hear stories like that, what goes through your mind?
When I hear that, I remember one time I was teaching the seminary wives. And as soon as I started talking, I could hear a kind of a grumbling in the room. And then one of them finally said, "You're the reason I don't get to see my husband very often." So it's those kinds of things that come back to my mind.
Yeah, your teaching was pretty intense in Hebrew. I can tell that you genuinely loved Hebrew and loved teaching it. Like it. In fact, you spent like over two decades training future pastors at Southern. So, what did you love most about teaching Hebrew and the Old Testament?
Yeah, I really enjoy teaching language. And so things like Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, any of the biblical languages, I really enjoyed. Now at Southern, I had to sort of specialize in the Old Testament. And of course, I went to Jewish schools. I didn't really go to a seminary. And so that's, and there I was taught, primary sources, learn the primary sources. And I really liked that. I think that was the one thing that I took away that's still with me today. You've got to master the primary sources. And so the languages is what I really enjoyed. Now, I also taught, classes in Old Testament. So Old Testament survey, I would teach that almost every year, or maybe even every semester. And then the Bible books. So, what I wanted to do is teach in such a way that the students would have greater faith when they left a class than when they came into the class. And so that was my main goal in teaching, and to help, build up the brethren so that, when they get in front of the people to preach or to teach, that they would truly know the Word of God. And I wanted them to know the biblical languages, so that, again, they would really understand the primary source as well.
And when they would do that, they have confidence that the word they're proclaiming is the word of God. So yeah, that's what I took away from it when I was there as well. You wrote the material that how many professors were using your material that you wrote?
Well, it varied at times, but I would say 1, 2, there was usually about 2 or 3 others that would do it. And we had one that was over at Boyce, I think, that was using it as well, which is the college that's associated with Southern Seminary. My understanding today is they've shadow banned me, and so nobody can use it today.
Wow.
Yeah, that's what I've been told.
So a lot of people were using your Hebrew, and as you just mentioned, you're shadow banned, which means you're not at Southern, and they let you go because you were of no use. You were, what was the official reason that they let you go? Before we talk about the real reason.
Yeah, the official reason given to me was because of COVID, and but it was interesting. They gave again pink slips to a lot of the newer professors, that's what you would expect. But there were a few of us that were older, and at one time we had tenure. And of course, Mohler wanted to take that away so he could get rid of people, that he didn't like. And so again, they gave it to you and then they took it away. And so Mohler used that opportunity to also get rid of some of the older professors that he didn't really care for. And the excuse, again, what I was told when I was let go, it was just COVID. It was just COVID. And if you were to look at my evaluations until the last year there, they were very good. The last one was not, and we'll go into a little bit of reason why. But they were all very good. I never had a bad recommendation when I was there, except for the last year, of course. And but he told the trustees I wasn't getting the job done. So the trustees got a different story than. And then one of the trustees, Tom Rush, asked him point blank, "Well, you've gotten rid of these professors. You're not going to hire anybody in the fall, are you?" And no, not going to do that. And then, of course, he hired people in the fall. And, of course, Tom was like, "Well, why didn't you hire them back?" "Oh, they weren't getting the job done. They weren't getting the job done." And so, again, it was supposed to be COVID. But, again, you're hiring people again. And you didn't hire any of the ones back that you let go. But you hired, more professors. That made Tom Rush so upset. He did a video about it. And he was very upset about that. Because, again, he felt that, it was underhanded.
Yeah. So you're not getting the job done. We got to downsize. But you would think, well, then why is everybody using your Hebrew material?
Yeah.
Why is everyone? Yeah, that's the head scratcher. Well, let's before we talk about the time in which you were let go, let's talk about kind of what led up to it, which is CRT, which is critical race theory, kind of the woke ideology. I kind of wanted to tell you how I first saw it. So I went to Southern, and I can honestly say most of 90% of my experience at Southern was very good, very helpful to me, and I look back fondly, except for I took one class on the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, and I thought, well, at the time I was really into apologetics and defending the faith, and I thought, well, this will be helpful for that. I'll be an understanding, because people are always bringing, what about these hidden Bible books? And so I wanted to be able to read them and defend why they're not scripture, and make good arguments about that, or how they may help our thinking about the time period. And what I learned was that the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha were about racism. And maybe that's why they're not in the Bible. And so I had a professor named Dr. Jarvis Williams, and this was in about the year 2015. And so it was before people were openly, it was before what you did, and it was before I think John Harris and others were exposing it. So I didn't have a category at the time for what this is and why it was wrong. It didn't sit right, especially with everything else I had learned from Southern and was learning, reading the Puritans and other godly men. It's just like, this thing is different. This is not what we've been taught. And yet here it was. And so I didn't know how to deal with it other than I knew I didn't like it. I couldn't quite categorize it. Looking back, I know what it is. So that's my experience. When did you start to see it creep into the cemetery? I almost call it the cemetery, the seminary. Yeah. And when did you start to notice it creeping in?
Well, the first thing that really caught my attention, well, there was a few things even before. One of the first things, I guess, when I first got hired, I was hired in 98 and I was let go in 20. It was 22 years I was there. And early on, I'd say within the first 2 years, one of the Old Testament professors, a man named Dan Block, gave a sermon on justification. And in there, he just denied the doctrine of the justification by grace through faith as a forensic justification. We're pronounced, as it were in a courtroom, we're pronounced just in the sight of God. He denied that. Mohler, I know, was not pleased with it, but there was nothing done really. There was no, you need to go back to chapel and say, hey, I kind of messed that up. There was nothing like that. I think Mohler was more embarrassed because this was early on. Mohler probably had only been president maybe 6-7 years at this time. And those original trustees, had they known about this, it could have been real problems for him. But they just basically let that go. And, that was very early on. And I remember thinking, no, this is not good. But then the thing that really struck me was, I'm not sure exactly the year, but it's probably about 2007 when Mohler came out and said that he accepts sexual orientation. And looking back at that, it's interesting. Again, it was around 2000. And the reason I bring this up is because, he was made president, I believe in 93, I believe was when he was made president. And if you do the math and go out 10 years, well, what he's able to do over those 10 years is basically, and maybe just a little bit more than 10 years, replace the original the trustees, replace the original trustees that hired him with basically people that he virtually handpicks. The trustee system is broken in the Southern Baptist Convention. And these agency heads and these seminary presidents can basically almost pick who they want to. Now, not completely, but pretty well they can put their own people on there. And of course, they want to put people on there who are going to be like bodyguards, whereas the trustee is supposed to, be the real gatekeepers to keep a school in line. But of course, the seminary presidents want someone who's just going to protect him and so forth. So if you go out about 10, 12 years, Mohler's able to get rid of most of the old trustees. Now he's got his guys in. And now I think he feels comfortable to just, start moving back to a liberal position, because he was a liberal all his years as a student there. He was very liberal. He led the charge, I think it was in 84, for women pastors. He took out, a 2-page thing in the Louisville Courier-Journal, saying with all these signatures on, but he was the man behind it, pushing, women pastors and so forth. So he was Roy Honeycutt, who was the president before him, very liberal. He was his right-hand man. And so he was far to the left. So now, of course, he made a real flip because I think well, as a matter of fact, if you go online, there's a video on YouTube, and that video is called Battle for the Minds.
Yeah.
And it was put out by the old liberal faculty. But yet it's a very interesting, and when they talk about Al Mohler, they'll talk about some of the old students that knew him, the old faculty, and they all say, hey, he was just like we were, but he recognized there was a change coming. He wanted to be president. And so he just flipped. And one of the guys on there, he says, I was in the room. I think it was in New Orleans. This was the last big battle. I'm not sure when that happened. It was probably one of the last great battles of, let's say, the conservative resurgence. So this is back around 1990, 91, right in that area. And Honeycutt gets up after the meeting and says, guys, the battle's over. We've lost. And so any more fighting won't do us any good. And they said right after that, Al went down to Atlanta. All of a sudden, he became head of the Baptist paper down in Georgia. And all of a sudden, he's writing the most conservative things, and they're all shaking their head, Later, an old professor would say to me, he goes, I was good friends with Honeycutt. He said, one time, right after Al got elected president, Roy had me over, and we were having dinner, and the subject of Mohler came up. And he says, so I asked Honeycutt, who was, again, that's who he was the right-hand man to Honeycutt. He goes, well, what do you think of Al? And Honeycutt says, well, had we moderates won the battle, Al Mohler would still be the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And if you go back to that video, it's interesting. There's one guy who says this on there. He goes, let me tell you, if the Southern Baptist Convention starts moving back to, a moderate or liberal position, Al Mohler will move there too. And really, he's been proven correct. And I'll say this, I've never, looking back, I don't know of any thoroughgoing liberal theologian who flipped overnight to be a conservative. I don't know of any other example of this ever happening. And again, the old school guys, the people who knew him very well, they believe it was just, he was being an opportunist. He wanted to be president. He would do whatever it took to be president. And again, once he got his trustees on, now he felt free to start moving back. And so he came out for sexual orientation. And when people like, there was a guy named Brian Fisher, he was a Christian radio host. And he kept trying to get information. He kept trying to contact Mohler and say, hey, could you explain what you mean by this? And he just would not. He would not engage with Brian Fisher. And it just showed you, because if Al were to say, on the one hand, yeah, well, you're born that way. I mean, he's in trouble. Or, well, we're not really born that way. What do you mean by sexual orientation? So he knew he couldn't defend it against Fisher or anybody for that matter. But at that point, I knew we've got problems. We've got real problems. And then, but when it came to the critical race theory, when it came to things like the what's called postmodernism, and then later you'll see people on the campus teaching the Bible's mythology, or the Bible contains mythology, something like this, you see. I didn't even recognize, like you mentioned Jarvis Williams teaching that during those, I think you said 2015 or somewhere around there. I'm not sure I remember that. And then one day, because I just, again, I didn't know what was going on in some of the other classrooms. And then one day we were and this was the big turning point for me. One day I'm in what's called a full professor's meeting. So you can't be an assistant professor or an associate. You got to be just called professor, So I'm in there and we're about to dismiss, and a man named Mark Coppinger says, I want to say something. And he starts talking about these videos that he saw from Southern Seminary. And he goes, these are pretty radical. And he goes, they're pushing critical race theory. And I remember when he said it, I'm like, what's he talking about? I had no idea I'm not even sure I knew what critical race theory was. I'm buried in the Old Testament department. So,
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on. But Coppinger says that. And then I notice Mohler goes into absolute panic mode. He wants to shut that down real quick, dismiss, and get out of there. I could tell his whole demeanor changed. And he became very defensive. And I could tell Mark had said something that really upset him. But he didn't want to attack Mark. He was just saying, hey, have you seen this? This is, And so when we dismissed, I went right to Coppinger. And I said, what are you talking about? And he goes, you've got to see these videos. And I said, okay. And so he sends me these links to it. And so I'm watching these things, and I cannot believe what I'm watching. And it's at the time, Matthew Hall was the dean of Boyce College. Okay. But he was Mohler's guy who was going to become the number 2 man at Southern Seminary. He was about to become the provost at Southern Seminary. And I watched these videos, and it was radical stuff. Jarvis Williams was there on these videos, Curtis Woods, and they were pushing, stuff. It was radical stuff. Matter of fact, one time I was watching these videos, and my daughter was going to the University of Louisville at this time. And she walked by and heard just a little bit of what was being said on these videos. And she goes, hey, that's what they're teaching me at the University of Louisville. I remember I just looked at her and shook my head. And she goes, oh, yeah, that's University of Louisville stuff right there. She had no idea it was Southern Seminary. She just saw me watching a video. She didn't know where it was coming from. Mm-hmm. And immediately, hey, I know what this is. And that's that nonsense I'm learning. And she didn't have to take many of those things. She was in a whole different world of study. Yeah. So she wasn't like an English major, something like this. But anyway, I remember hearing her say that, and I just kind of shook my head. And by the way, I'll just get off just a little bit here. While I was watching those videos, I looked on the side. You know how it is on YouTube. You got those little side things.
Recommendations, yes.
And all of a sudden, I see John Harris. And I don't know John Harris. And I see John Harris, and it says the problems at Southeastern Seminary. And I'm like, really? So as soon as I don't even know if I even watched the ones I was watching at Southern, I went over and clicked on his. But my wife and I had to go somewhere. So I remember saying, hold on, I want to download this so I can listen to it on where we're going. And so we're traveling, and we don't get 4 minutes. We don't get 4 minutes. And I look at her. I stopped at a red light or someplace. And I looked at her, and I remember saying to her, this guy, it's John Harris. I didn't know who he was. I said, listen to this guy. I said, you know what? I know he's telling the truth. And she goes, how do you know that? You don't go to, And I go, that's Southern Seminary he's describing. I know he's describing Southeastern. But actually, he could just as well be describing Southern Seminary. And so all of a sudden, I became, you talking about being woke, I got woke, but I woke the other way. I was now aware of what was going on at the different schools. I started watching these videos and getting educated by people like John Harris and others. And I'm like, whoa, seeing these things on video. And it made a real difference in me in the sense that, and then I started looking for it, and I started seeing it on campus. And, I would ask some of the students, and oh yeah. And they would tell me stories that was going on, and it was bad. It was bad. And it was getting a lot worse, especially after you left, Joseph. Not that, not because.
When I left, it all went down, I'm sure.
That's right. But it did. It was getting worse and worse. And
what was the point in which you were like, I can't stay silent about this?
Yeah. Let me just say a couple more things, and I'll tell you when. Yeah, this happened. We were going to promote a guy named, again, in the full professors meeting, it's part of our jobs to kind of tell the administration, we think this guy should be promoted, so forth. Well, Jonathan Pennington was very well known on campus as teaching postmodernism, and by postmodernism, I'll just give you, postmodernism is they don't like absolutes, like absolute truth. And they would look at a text and say, listen, it's kind of like one of the Supreme Court justices in the past. It's a living, breathing document. I think it was Brennan who said that. It's a living, breathing document. In other words, it doesn't have fixed meaning. The reader, sort of decides the meaning and weird stuff like this, And so we're going to put him up for a promotion. And right before it happened, this was like just a few weeks before it happened, a student was in my office and he goes, "You got to see this." And so he gives me this document, which was a paper that Pennington had given at a scholarly conference. And he goes, "This is the real Jonathan Pennington. This is what he's teaching in the class." So I read it and it was just full of heresy. I mean, just unbelievable. And so, and I said, "Who else did you give this to?" It was one other professor. So I went to that professor and said, "Look, one of us has got to share this with the administration. I hope it'll be you because I know the administration doesn't think very highly of me. They do think highly of you. Well, would you do it? But if you don't, I will." And he goes, "No, I'll do it." I said, "Okay." And then sure enough, a couple of days later, I get summoned into the dean's office. And we're about 2 weeks away from making a decision on whether to promote this individual. And so, of course, first the dean asked me, "What's your opinion of that paper?" And I said, "It's pure heresy. Pure heresy." And he didn't like that answer, but it was true.
What was the paper about?
It was basically a critique of the notion that basically going against, especially scholars like Greg Beale, who likes to see connections between the Old and New Testaments. So, like for instance, Jonathan Pennington would say, and he'd said it in the paper, Isaiah 53 has nothing to do with Christ. Nothing. If you were to go back in time, we've been, and he was pushing this book by this Calvin professor. And if his name comes to me again, I'll give it to you. But this professor, again, was teaching this, the same thing. And so Pennington really liked this book. It was called Reading the Bible Critically is the name of it, okay? Where I say you can't do that. You either read the Bible in faith or you read it in unbelief, which is critically. The Bible should be a critic upon us, not we be critics upon Scripture, okay?
That's true, yep.
But again, this book, Isaiah 53 has nothing to do with Jesus. We're all brainwashed into reading Christ in the Old Testament. Pennington goes and says, the Bible's not our only authority for faith and practice. Creeds work as well. And I'm like, whoa, you got to be kidding me. And so it was just full of heresy. But here's where I start to get myself in real trouble. I said to the dean, "Are we going to show the other faculty members this document so they can read it? So when they come in the meeting in 2 weeks, they will have knowledge on how to vote?" And the answer was no. And I was shocked. I was like, wait a minute, doesn't the faculty deserve all the facts about what this man is teaching, both in our classrooms and when he goes to these scholarly conferences, what he's teaching? Shouldn't we know all the facts before we vote on him? No, we're not going to we can't let him see this paper. Why not? Well, we just can't. And then I said to the dean, well, in that case, when I go in there, I will inform them about this paper because I cannot in good conscience go in there and have these guys vote blindly. And I said, so I will stand up and I will do it. And I could tell I had, I'd crossed a line there, Well, they decided not to do it that year. They were afraid to do it. They didn't do it. And they thought, let's give it another year and we'll do it. But again, I said to them, are you going to show them this paper? They were still kind of like, no, we don't want to do that. So I forgot now whether they ever saw it. I don't think they did. If I remember right, I don't think they did. But anyway, that was that's the administration right there.
What gave you the courage to do that just there? Because that's before you've gotten let go and all that.
Yeah. I could not believe that the dean would look me in the eye and say, we're not going to share this information. Because you see, what they do is they send us all of their work. Basically, they give us papers, they show us what they published, and all these things so that we can read them and go in the meeting and have. Of course, I don't think any of us ever hardly read the stuff, but at least they give us the stuff. And I'm saying, well, are we going to give them this paper? And when they answered no, I was in shock. I couldn't believe the answer. I couldn't believe the dean, just with a straight face and like, yeah, why would we want to give them this? I'm like, come on. And so I maybe I didn't have time to think about the cost of what I was doing, because it so shocked me when he said that. And I'm like, this can't be. Yes, it was. And I was absolutely shocked at this. So anyway, when we finally do, in a year, we vote on him. And let me just tell you this, how it works. And all the time I was there as a full professor, hardly anyone got a no vote. And if you got one no vote, that hardly was nothing, because there was like 30 people in the room voting. And if you get one no vote, it was just like nothing. And so it was basically 100% vote, basically. Well, the day we were voting on Pennington, if you added up all the votes, they added up to about 270 votes. We gave more promotions that day than I think in any other time in Southern's history. And so out of the 270 votes, one vote out of 270 was against one guy. So, I mean, everything was just like, 100%, 100%, 100%. When we get to Pennington, and again, I didn't go talk to professors. To me, first of all, it was getting around. It was getting around what had happened and everything. So I think the people walked in there with some knowledge. I really do. And again, but I'm not a guy who's going to go politic. If you don't have enough of the Holy Spirit in you to know how to vote on this, what am I going to do? I'm not here to be a whip like in Washington, D.C. or something. I'm not going to do that. Well, anyway, it shocked me. I thought we'd get about 3 votes against him. It ended up almost being 50% against him. It was unbelievable. I think it was 16-14 for him, but that was disastrous. And so Mohler, I thought he was going to get all upset at us, but he started saying, I didn't like his works. I didn't like his books. I was shocked he was saying this. The problem is, as Tom Schreiner would later email me, that book that Mohler was saying he doesn't like just happened to be one of the books that Mohler recommended as one of the books of the year in one year. Yeah, that was true. So, but anyway, and then Mohler says, we'll have to talk to him and da-da-da-da-da. Well, and we'll bring him in and we'll interview him for us all so we'll all know. Well, that never happened. Mohler said that, but he had no intention of doing that. And he had no intention of doing anything against this candidate, you see. Well, I think at that moment, though, for what I did just right there, I was on Mohler's bad list, shall we say.
You were not getting any book of the year.
Yeah. And then I'll tell you this, the year was 2019. And I went to part of the Southern Baptist Convention in Birmingham, Alabama. And that was the Resolution 9. And there, one of our faculty, Curtis Woods, was the one pushing it from the platform. And again, it was a useful tools and all this kind of stuff. And when that went through, and I know people will say later, they didn't know what they were voting on. I don't believe that for a second. I mean, maybe 1 or 2% didn't know. Those people know a whole lot more. Now they'll all act like we just didn't know. I don't buy it. I do not buy it. And just like right now, a lot are regretting the vote in 2021. I was there in the room when we voted for the independent investigation about sexual abuse. Okay. And now I see people on Facebook, oh, it was terrible, terrible. They voted for it. I was in the room. Me and my son and just a handful of other people voted against it. Everybody in that room voted for it. Now people are acting like, oh, they were all against it. And we didn't know what we were voting on. That is it's just not true. It's not true. And so people will do these things, unfortunately. Well, let me just tell you that I'm kind of skipping around a little bit in time. But the semester before I was let go, they invited me to a trustee lunch. And I thought, I'm already dead man walking because I did something else, which I'll tell you in just a second. And I knew Mohler wanted me out of there. I knew he did. And but I was invited to this trustee lunch. And I thought, I better not go because I'm in such trouble already. But then I thought, I'm dead no matter what. Why don't I just go? So I go. And I'm at there and I see this trustee next to me, and he's an old student at Southern Seminary. And of course, I didn't know him I didn't have him as a student as far as I know. And I looked at him and I said, can I ask you a question as a pastor and as a trustee? And he goes, yeah. And I said, did you go to the convention this year? And he goes, yes. I said, what'd you think about it? And he goes, I didn't like it. I said, what didn't you like about it? And he didn't want to answer. He just immediately started, I could tell, he became very uncomfortable. And so I said, what about that panel on racism? What did you think about that? Oh, I didn't like that. Well, what did you think about this? I didn't like that. What did you think about Russell Moore's little speech? I didn't like that. And then finally I said, what did you think about Resolution 9? And he goes, I didn't like that. And I go, do you realize that the man who was on that platform pushing for Resolution 9 is a professor at this institution? Do you know that? And he goes, yes, I do. And I said, as a trustee, what are you going to do? I'm not going to do anything. I've only been a trustee for 3 or 4 years. I mean, I can't do anything. And finally, I put my finger almost in his chest. And some of the other trustees saw this. You need to do your duty. You need to do your duty. But they're all in fear because they'll be blackballed, you see. And they won't, if something happens, by the way, and what they will do in your church is they'll try to stir up trouble in your church and get you fired. And once you get fired, they'll blackball you and you won't find another church. They all know this. They know these games. I know a pastor down in Louisiana, they just tried to pull that on not too long ago. And even A.D. Robles, if you remember, they did that. They pulled that stunt on him too. They knew who to call up in your church to make a hit on you. And so these guys they were in fear. I could tell they were in fear. And it was very sad. It was very sad. But let me tell you what, the thing that was the sort of the last straw that put me on Mohler's death list. And that was, I had they bring you in and give you an evaluation.
Men, it's time to reclaim what was lost. The kind of fellowship, tradition, and meaningful conversation that stems from the simple pleasure of a fine cigar. At Patriarch Cigars, we craft premium cigars with the same convictions that build strong families and lasting legacies, which is why we are proud to partner with the Patriarchy podcast. As a thoroughly and unapologetically Christian company, this is not about trends. It's about building something to the glory of Christ. It's about men gathering with purpose, sharpening one another, and leading well. Every cigar is a reminder of who we are called to be. Visit patriarchcigars.com. Light one up, smoke with purpose, and lead your families, all to the glory of God.
And again, I got a good evaluation that year. Okay, it was my next to last one, I think. It was a good evaluation. And then the dean made a mistake and said, is there any concerns you have that we should know about? And I said, well, Greg, I've told you my concerns in the past, but if you want me to, I'll tell you again. Oh yeah, please tell me. And I said, Pennington's postmodernism. And then I went, and then I said this: Jarvis Williams, Curtis Woods, and then I named Matthew Hall and the race theory that these guys are pushing. And I could see Greg's eyes getting just huge. And I could tell I was touching, as they call it, the third rail. You touch that and you just, you're dead. And I said, I'm very concerned about this at this institution. And I said, I'm thinking about writing Mohler about it. And he goes, well, you'd be very careful if you write Mohler about this. And I go, well, yeah, I'll be careful. And I said, but what else could I do? And he goes, well, I guess writing is probably a good idea. I said, okay. And so I wrote Mohler. And again, I thanked him. I said, thank you for, 20 years being here and so forth. And I said, I do have some concerns. And I let him know my concerns. It made Mohler furious. I think he read it. The dean, the provost at the time told me Mohler calls him like almost 11 o'clock at night on a Saturday night, yelling at him because of my letter. And so I got called in. I was given a letter of reprimand. They got all over my case. But what I said was the truth. All I did was speak the truth. And they were just furious with me.
What was their letter? What did they give you a letter of reprimand? What are they reprimanding you for doing?
I'm saying false things about other professors, causing trouble. I've been told, they say they don't believe in critical race theory, but look, go online and listen. You've been in the class. I mean, Joseph, you were in class with Jarvis Williams. We could call you in and say, were you being taught critical race theory? It'd be that easy. But they had to do something to basically give. That's what they give you before they fire you, is a letter of reprimand. So they've gone through the proper channels to fire you. So that was just their first step, basically, in order to fire me. Okay. But the last straw, the last straw, the one that really got me was when Mohler was going to promote Matthew Hall to be the second man at Southern Seminary. Okay. The number 2 man. And Mohler did something here very different than he did in the past. What he does this time, before we get a week to look at all the information on a candidate, he doesn't contact us with the information until 2 days. We hardly have 2 days. We don't have 48 hours to look at the information on Matt Hall and the others. And there's no doubt in my mind he did that on purpose, because he knew there could be pushback. Well, as soon as I see this, I made a phone call. But first, I wrote up why I would be voting against him. I wrote it up, and then I called up Mark Coppinger. And I said, Mark, did you see we're going to put, Matt Hall up? And he goes, yeah. And I said, how are you going to vote on that? And he goes, I'm going to vote against it. And I said, okay, I am too. And I said, listen, I've written something up. Would you mind reading this and then let me know what you think? And he goes, oh yeah, send it to me. He sent that thing back to me within it seemed like 30 seconds, but it had to be a little bit more than that. But it was very fast. He goes, Russell, he goes, it's clear and it's stout. And he goes, but change one word. Now remember, Mark is a philosopher and a very good one. Okay. Philosophy major. He goes, change the word atheistic to secular. I said, okay. It took me 6 months to figure out what's the difference here? But it was, and I said, sure, I'll do it. So I'm driving over by myself on the way, and I'm stopped at a red light, and I'm on my way to give this speech. And I know this will be, I might be fired right in the meeting. I don't know. And by the way, let me just tell you this. I was on sabbatical that semester. I didn't have to go to the meeting. I could have hid under my bed, but I thought, this is it. This is the man who's pushing critical race theory. Of course, it's Al Mohler, really, but Al's right-hand man who's pushing this. If we don't fight this one, what is there left to fight? What is there left? If I let this go, what's coming down the pike that I can stand up and say, well, you let that go. What's your problem now? You know what I'm saying? And so I knew this is the issue. This is the issue. And if I don't stand up for this, just go hide under your bed. That's the way I felt. And really, I'd have trouble sleeping at night. I couldn't look myself in the mirror if I didn't show up and do this. But I remember I was riding over there. I was stopped at a red light, and I just looked at the empty seat, over there. And I thought, if the Apostle Paul were sitting there, he would look at me and say, you're just a chicken. Because I knew I'm a little guy. I can feel my heart beating pretty good sometimes. And I can feel my blood pressure. I knew my blood pressure was through the roof. But I remember thinking, if the Apostle Paul was there, you're just a chicken because they're not going to kill you. They're not going to hit you with, rods. They're not going to beat you. But yet I felt like a chicken going in. So I show up, and what they do is we have a little lunch first. And I didn't think I was going to eat one bite of that lunch. And then right after that, we go into the business session, let's say. So we're in there, and this professor next to me starts talking about diet. And I get so involved with him, I ate half my meal because my mind was totally into diet talk, okay, it was wonderful. Right before the meeting starts, Coppinger comes over to me. He whispers in my ear, "Russell, you don't have to do this." And when he said that, I could feel this yellow streak running straight down my spine. I wanted to chicken out right then. I'm like, "Mark," but I didn't say anything to him. I was just like, oh. Then we went to business. And when Mohler goes, "Okay, we're going to now discuss Matt Hall." And what happens is one professor gets up and gives a presentation on why we ought to promote him. And I think it was Herschel York, who did it, which doesn't surprise me. And so I think it was York who gave that speech. And then Mohler looks at us and goes, "Okay, does anyone have anything to say?" And this is when I was the most afraid, because I didn't want to lead off. And I kept looking at Coppinger, almost wanting to, reach out and hit him. "Please speak." And Coppinger finally raises his hand, and I'm like, "Oh, great." And then when he does, I raise my hand, because I saw Mohler saw him raise his hand. So I came up second, and Mohler nodded at me. And so Coppinger says why he won't vote for him. Then it came my time. And I had a 2-page paper. I had to read it. Because if I made one mistake on there, I knew I was going to be attacked. So I had to get every word exactly right. Because mostly what I was doing was quoting Matt Hall himself. I was quoting him. Billy Graham's ministry, full of whiteness and all, all the buzzwords of critical race theory. But then about halfway, well, it was a little bit, about 3/4 of the way through the paper, I put the paper down and I look up, and the people are looking at me with their eyes look like they're 3 times the size there should be, And I said, "For this reason, before I walked in this morning, I signed the Dallas Statement." And of course, the Dallas Statement is against critical race theory and all these things. And you could literally hear a pin drop in that room. And we had a carpeted floor there too, so And then I finished reading the paper. Well, later a professor will tell me, he goes, "The whole time you were reading, Russell, I was watching Mohler. He was getting angrier and angrier and angrier every moment you were speaking." And once it came time for Mohler to respond to what not just me, but others had spoken. And I need to mention one other name real quick. And that is Jim Orrick. Jim Orrick got up and made a great speech, again, speaking the truth. And if it wasn't for Jim Orrick and Mark Coppinger, I'll just be quite frank with you. I don't know if I'd have the guts to do it or not. Those guys were very helpful. Even though I didn't speak to Jim at all. Until maybe afterwards. But the mere fact that, he spoke up to Coppinger, those guys, the Lord used them to help me to do it, even though he almost got me to chicken out. But still, he really did. He really helped me. And when I got, when everyone had spoken, Mohler looked at me and said, "Russell," and he said at the top of his voice, "You are an idiot." And he started screaming and yelling, and he couldn't go against anything I said, really, because I had just quoted most of the time, you see. And so there was nothing he could do. But what he started doing is defending critical race theory. He started saying, there is a problem. We have a problem with whiteness. We have a problem with systemic racism. He started going right down the line. He affirmed basically everything of critical race theory. And then I'll never forget this. He sort of calmed down a little bit, and he he looked and he goes, Marxism has insights. And I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. Marxism has insights. Now, in the context, he's talking about critical race theory. And he sees Marxism as something that has insights. And I'm just thinking, whew, he's gone. He's way out there. Now, at the end of the meeting, he realized he made a huge mistake. And by the way, while he was screaming and yelling at me, I'm so glad he did, because I would have punched back. But I knew he had dug a big hole. And I knew if I'll just keep my mouth shut, I'm okay. And I mean, but he did, he kind of sort of bullied me and so forth. I'd love for him to debate me now. Of course, he would never do it now. He could only bully you, while you're the employee. He would never publicly, and I've challenged him, but anytime he wants to, publicly debate these issues about what he said and so forth, I'd be more than happy to do so. But he would never do that. But I did speak and say a few things, but I was much more careful. The Lord let me get, again, control of myself so I wouldn't say anything out of line. But later he tried to say, he went, Russell, you're not an idiot, But I could tell even the faculty members, one of them right after the meeting says, that's the best apology you're going to get. And he said it with total disgust, what Mohler did. And then I remember, I'll just tell you this one other story. So Coppinger and I are walking out together, and we walked down the hall a little bit, and one professor starts screaming at me. And I'm like, oh no, I'm about to get it, Russell. I hear him screaming my name. And I think, he was another one of the philosophy guys. And he walks up to me and he goes, that was great. What you said was absolutely right. And I was like, but see, I was truly dead man walking at that time. Then later, it was a few months later, Mohler finally called me to his office with Matt Hall, with Herschel York, to work me over, okay, and to threaten me and all sorts of things. And so Mohler was like, what's your problem with these guys? And I said, no, what they're teaching is heresy and it's against the abstract, which is the document. He goes, you can't say that. I said, it's true. He goes, but you can't say that. And I said, but it's true. We went back like 4 times on this. And finally, I forgot. He said something to me like, I finally said to him, what do you want me to say? And he says, well, it appears to you that it's not consistent or something like, it was something silly like that. And I said, okay, I'll say that for you if you want me to, but let me tell you, it's heresy. It's not consistent with the document. And he was so frustrated. He says, am I getting through to him, to the other guys? And the answer was no. Then he started his threats. Well, do you want to bring this before the faculty? I said, if that's what you think we should do, I'm more than willing to do it. Well, not one faculty will vote with you. And I go, that's fine, let's do it. And it just infuriated, because I think he's used to, when he threatens you, you go, oh, I'm. And then he goes, I'll bring you before the trustees, and every trustee will vote against you. And I didn't want to tell him, I know one that would vote with me, Tom Rush, but Tom would have. But I said, that's fine. Let's go before the trustees. He finally had to leave the room at one point. He was so upset. I think he was about to yell and scream at me again. So he had to leave. And, but again, they threatened to fire me, all these things. And finally I said, when we were breaking up the meeting, I said, can I speak to you privately? And he goes, I could tell he didn't want to, I don't think. He said, okay. And I said, what are the questions you asked me? You asked me, do I have any confidence in you? And of course, I didn't answer him at the time. And I said, I'll answer that question now. And I said, I'll tell you when I lost confidence in you. When you accepted sexual orientation. I said, at that moment, I had lost confidence in you that you were. And I said, but let me tell you, I'm going to keep raising my voice because of these students. I'm going to keep raising my voice, whatever the cost. And I let him know, if that means I'm let go, that's fine. But I will say what needs to be said. And he didn't like that. And I'll just tell you one other quick story. One time I got called in, I forgot for what reason this time. They're all about the same stuff, though. It's all the same stuff. And the student didn't tell on me, but I told on myself because I wanted the provost to know this. I said, a student asked me the other day, I hear we hired a new professor in Old Testament. And I said, that's correct. And he goes, I want to know your opinion about him. And I shook my head no. And I said, I said, I'm against this professor. And the student, and I told him why. He wanted to know why. I says, he believes the Bible teaches mythology. That's why. And the student looked at me, he goes, that's why I ask you, Dr. Fuller. I knew you would give me a straight answer. I told that to the provost and he hit the roof. You can't say that to the students. And I said it to them because it's the truth and I will say it to them again. I said, I spoke the truth and I'll say it again. I will not lie to these students. We will fire you. I said, you go right ahead, but I will not lie to the students. And I said it with quite about the way I said it to you right now. I said it with real force. You go right ahead. If you need to fire me, you fire me. I'm not lying to these students, though. I'm not going to say these are good guys when they're not good guys. Just to finish that story just real quick, I'm in the locker room one day, and one of Mohler's top assistants is in there. And I look at him and go, we're about to hire another liberal. He goes, no. I go, yeah. He goes, do you have the write-up on this? I said, I sure do. And I gave him all the information so he could look it up himself. And I said, let me tell you, when you do your research on this, if I'm wrong on one word, you let me know and I'll take that word back. If I'm wrong on one word of what I'm saying. He goes, okay. 2 weeks, he contacts me. He goes, you nailed it. It's exactly what this guy said. That's exactly what he believes. Well, one of his jobs was preparing Mohler for interviews because Mohler didn't read the stuff. He gets these other people to read the stuff for him. And he told me, he says, I told Mohler, you've got to ask him about this, everything you said, Dr. Fuller. And so after the interview, this guy goes up to Mohler and he goes, well, did you hire him? And Mohler goes, of course. And he goes, how could you hire him? And Mohler's response was, I know his doctrine of inspiration is all messed up, but he says he can sign our statement of faith and that's all that matters. That's Al Mohler. And that's Southern Seminary right there.
Well, Dr. Fuller, I appreciate the stand that you have taken and for you walking us through. And I get the sense of almost just being there as you're telling what happened and how visceral, how, the question I want to ask is how does a man stand firm? But as you tell it, it almost seems like it's just automatic. Like it's, you were compelled. How was that a right way to say that? Like you didn't really have to think about it?
It is. I really did feel compelled. I could have played the political game. I mean, I know how to play the game if I need to play the game, let's say. But, I think there's souls at stake. And, there were other professors who were seeing the same thing I was seeing because they would tell me. They knew what was going on. I remember one professor told me that, oh, yeah, every time the students come out of Pennington's class into mine, I have to spend the first half, getting them off what Pennington was saying because it was terrible stuff, So, and what I did is I wanted to, there were probably other times I should have stood and I probably didn't as I should have. But sometimes you want to wait till the situation is so clear that I think a person who would be, honest with the facts would say, of course, this is going on, And so I think I did try to wait until the situation was so clear that how can you not say something? And again, they would say, oh, like Herschel York likes to say, critical race theory has never been taught on this campus. And I don't know how he says it with a straight face. I don't know how he does it.
Jarvis Williams said in our class this sentence. He said, racial reconciliation is the gospel.
Correct. Yeah, sure.
Not even that it's a fruit of the gospel, but that is the gospel. And
that's right.
he made clear that we knew that it wasn't the fruit, like that,
That's right.
that as we are united in Christ, then there can be brotherly love in the church but no, this is, and when you do that, that's a different gospel.
That is correct. And by the way, on a video, and I think you can still see this video online. There's a video online where there's a panel discussion. He's on it and Matt Hall. And this may not be the one online, but I have the other one if people really want to see it. And what he says at the very end of this thing, he talks about justification. He keeps saying, now, I believe in justification. Now, when somebody's talking like that, you're like, oh, why is he saying that so loud? And, but then he goes, but you need to fight for racial reconciliation just like you do the atonement. Because he really saw those as all part of the gospel to him. And really by racial reconciliation, he's talking about critical race theory. And if you look at his book, that Mohler was as they would say, he was the inspiration for this book, removing the stain of racism. And I think Mohler writes in there. But Jarvis makes it very clear in that book how critical race theory has helped him, and what he's writing and so forth. That was a big part of his critical race theory is a big influence upon him. And again, I think he's made it into the gospel, or part of the gospel, put it that way.
Yeah. So you stood for truth and you took a hit, right? We didn't really get into it. You got let go.
Let go. Fired.
How do you keep from getting bitter about that?
Oh, there was some bitterness. There was certain bitterness there. Let me just say this, though. For the last 2 years at Southern Seminary, they were constantly threatening to fire me. And at one point, Mohler even said to me, don't ever write me a letter. If you've got an issue, you just speak to me and we'll talk, but never write me a letter. Which I thought to myself, does he understand what he's saying? He doesn't want any paper trail, any proof that a discussion has taken place with him. And so for the last 2 years there, they were constantly threatening to fire me. And again, it was not a pleasant situation there. When COVID hit, which was 2020, it was around February, somewhere in February, I think it was, or maybe early into March is when it hit. We had a meeting, and in that meeting, it was said, we're going to have to let go of faculty because of COVID. Well, I knew who had to be first on that list. It was me. And sure enough, it was. I was one of the first ones, I'm sure. But when they finally, and of course, it was just a few days later, they let me go. So I really had a few days notice. But I felt a relief. I felt relief. You can't threaten me anymore. You can't, your threats are no longer any good. And, I felt like at that point I had done my duty before God. I had spoken the truth and I didn't want to quit. I didn't want to be a quitter, even though they wanted me to quit. Oh yeah, they wanted me to quit, but I'm like, no, I'll keep, even in the classroom. Now, again, I wouldn't necessarily call out professors by name, but I would go after their heresies, and they knew what I was doing. They knew, the students, they knew what was going on. And so I had no problem doing that. But I felt, hey, I'll stay. And when the Lord relieves me of duty here, I can live with that. What gave me a little bit of bitterness was to hear their attacks upon me. Because some of the attacks were unbelievable to me. One of the professors went online and goes, look, there's no heresy being taught here. There's no problems here at Southern Seminary. And that same professor, we used to have him over for dinner at my house, and he would spend half the night telling me about the people he was, the heresy that's being taught by this guy and this guy and this. He would say that right here in my house. But, once this happened, there's no heresy, there's no problems here at Southern Seminary. No, it's a bastion of, conservative orthodoxy. And I'm thinking, how many times has this guy had dinner in my house? And again, half the time he's talking about, Bruce Ware's view about the Trinity. That's terrible. And then he'd talk about this problem and that problem. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I know what you're saying. And it was things like that where they would say one thing to me and to others. I'd hear him say it to others as well. And then they would go online and say, Fuller doesn't know what he's talking about. And they were the same people who would say this. They would say it to me. This is a real problem. And so like, how can you do that? But, they wanted to show, like, well, I'll give you this one example is, I couldn't believe this. I get a call from one of the professors, and Mohler's decided again to try to get Jonathan Pennington to a full professors, and he's all upset. And so he calls me up because he wants me to lead the charge. But yet I don't trust this professor. I've learned enough from him. You can't trust what he says. And so he goes, we've got to stand, and we're going to do something. And I just go, okay. And I can tell he's like, yes, Fuller, he's not excited. And I was like, yeah, okay. He calls me back in 3 weeks and he goes, I sent him a letter and he responded, and I think I can vote for him now. And I knew what had happened. I knew a list was being made of the faculty who was going to get fired. And so immediately I can vote for him now because he didn't want to get on that list. And then after I get let go, he goes on Facebook. I would let Jonathan Pennington teach my children. Within 2 months, he went from wanting to declare war on Pennington to keep him from being promoted to teaching his children in 2 months. And when you see that kind of action, bitterness can definitely get the worst of you. So, oh yeah, I did. And I still dream about it. I'll tell you that right now. Some days, some nights, I still dream about these things. But I will say overall, and again, bitterness can keep coming back. It's not just like I got the victory. It can come back. But I have to think, I got to get my eyes off these guys and look at myself, because guess what? I'm made of the same clay they are. And I've got many of the same weaknesses that they do. Oh, I might not have done that weakness or that way, of course. But don't worry, I've got a good list. And on Judgment Day, it's not good. And therefore, I've got to say, hey, listen, the Lord's been gracious to me. I need to be gracious in all ways. Pray for these men. Help them, and I do. I pray for them that God will, not just work in them, work in me. I need the Lord to work in me. And as I've told you, there were times, I'm sure, when I should have spoke up. And there's even times now when God gives me an opportunity to witness, and I feel like I've chickened out time and time again. And so I don't want your listeners today to think, Fuller's this paragon of courage. It's not true. But yet I really did feel like the Lord would have me to do what I did. I really do. And I felt, did I do everything perfectly? Of course not. If I could go back in time, would I change some things? Probably, but I wouldn't do it all over again because I'd make too many more mistakes. So it's not I would do that. So in one sense, I wouldn't go back, because I know if I went back to correct those mistakes, I'd make others, you see. But I really felt at the end of the day, Joseph, this is what I thought. Does my job mean more to me than my loyalty to Christ? That's what it came down to. I know what the truth is. I knew what the truth was. And now the issue is, are you just going to ignore that so you keep your job and that you're, in good with Mohler and you won't get in trouble, you'll be a good boy? Or will you tell the truth? And what about those students? Can you look them in the eye? Can you get up in front of them and say, thus says the Lord, and you're not doing anything to help them against the nonsense that they're being taught? I couldn't do that. I just couldn't do that. And so to me, it came down to, is it your job, the money, the fame, the name? What is it? Or is it to be loyal to what I knew and I know was the truth? And that's why I had to do it. And so, yeah, I did feel very compelled.
What's the Lord have you doing now?
I teach online. You can see some of my books back there, but I teach online now. And I tell you, Joseph, I don't have a big school, okay? But let me tell you, I've got fantastic students. And those guys, we have a great time. And so, like last semester, I taught on Isaiah, I taught the book of Psalms, and I taught some Greek and Hebrew classes. Then I have Tom Rush. Tom Rush, even when he was a trustee at Southern, was teaching with me online. And Tom Rush teaches with me. And I got another guy who teaches with me. And let me tell you what, I wouldn't go back. Because first of all, I'd get fired much quicker next time. I wouldn't make it by the afternoon. Because again, this time I would even, I wouldn't last at all. And I'm so pleased what I'm doing right now. The Lord has provided in marvelous ways for me. And so I'm teaching online and teaching what I want to teach. I teach Old, New Testament, Bible, Old, New. I get to teach anything I want to. Of course, I'll let the other guys teach whatever they want to. And it's wonderful. It's called Theology Classroom. And we've been doing it for 5 years. The Lord has allowed this to go on for 5 years, hopefully many more years. I got to tell you how I started this. And, I was 60 years old when I got fired. And so they offered me, the school did, to sell me the computer equipment that I was using at the school. It belonged to the school and they would sell it to me. Well, I was like, I'm not so interested. And so I said that to the people, but the guy goes, hey, listen, Dr. Fuller, the guy who's getting you these prices, he loves you. Please let him get you the prices. I said, okay. He gave me some good prices. I said, okay, I'll buy it. And so I go to pick up the equipment and the guy looks at me and he says, you know what you ought to do? You ought to go online and teach. And I smiled, nodded my head, but I was thinking, that's crazy. That's insanity. I'll starve to death. All these things are going through my mind. And so I get in my car, start driving home. I live only 4 miles away from the campus. And on my way home, I'm like, maybe I should do this, But at 60 years old, you normally don't start your first business. You don't do that. So I have 2 good friends that I thought, I'll call them up. And they won't spare me. And I was so embarrassed to ask them this. And I told them, I said, now listen, don't laugh. I'm gonna say something to you. Please don't laugh at me, okay? And I said, what about maybe going online and teaching? And the first guy goes, you've got to do that. It's a great idea. And I'm like, really? Yes, you've got to do this. Okay. I asked my other friend, I go, now don't laugh at me. I said, but this is what I'm thinking. You've got to do this. You're kidding me. And so within 2 months, I'm basically starting a school, Now we're not accredited. We're never going to be accredited. We don't care about accreditation. But yet we teach the Word of God. And I'm having a great time. And a lot of the guys have been with me for 5 years. A lot of the people, they've been with me 4 years. A lot of them have. We have a great time. And again, we don't do anything that's super technical. Now, we do have advanced Greek and Hebrew, a little bit more, yes. But we do a lot of classes that anybody, again, when I'm going through Isaiah or something, you don't have to have any seminary or anything. I'm just doing English Bible and talking about what is Isaiah saying here and just teaching the book of Isaiah or whatever we're doing. In the fall, I'll be doing Romans. So I'll do Romans 1, and then in the winter, I'll do Romans 2. I'm going to do a sort of a study of the Christian life. And we're going to go through Pilgrim's Progress. That will be sort of taking us through the Christian life. And we'll be looking at sort of the verses that really kind of support what John Bunyan was using when he wrote that book. And so, we're going to do that. And then there'll be, again, advanced Greek, advanced Hebrew. But we do all kinds of Greek and Hebrew and so forth. And I think Tom Rush will do Daniel. And then he's going to do Hebrews in the winter. And then my other professor is a guy named Richard McDonald. And Richard is going to teach Church History 1 and 2 for us. And he'll do a great job. And again, it's for all people. I mean, if you've never, high schoolers could take it and they'll do just fine. And again, we don't give tests. We don't do any of that stuff. We don't do tests. If you come to class, and again, we videotape it. So even if you can't make it to class, you can watch it on video, audio, whatever you want. And there's no exams. I don't call on you in class and embarrass you or anything. We just have a good time, and you can ask questions. But a lot of times I get so fired up, it's hard for people to ask me questions. That's bad. But I do that. But that's what I'm doing now. And also the Lord has me doing other things. Some things, I can't tell you all, but I teach some underground places, let's say it that way. And that's fabulous. And
Dr. Fuller, I have really enjoyed our time here and love hearing about how God's still using you. Just one last question. Now that you've gone through this and you've experienced this, what advice do you give a man listening that maybe he's in a similar situation? There's some truth that he needs to speak to. What advice do you give him?
Yeah, this is a very difficult issue because my main issue is you better be in prayer about this. Because, any organization or any place where we work, we're going to see problems. We are. And, some problems we have to just say, look, that's, we're all frail. We're going to see some things. And I'm not talking about terrible things, but yet there's still things that are not right in the sight of God. Okay. But yet there come some issues that, okay, this is truly doing harm, or this is truly something that, this is an abuse thing that has to be revealed. This cannot be kept secret. Okay. And again, it's going to have to be a case by case situation. I think most of the time I don't have a clear, here's the line, once this line's crossed, obviously something's criminal. Yes, that's a line. So I could give you some lines, but but when you see something that is just, this is not just human frailty. This is not just, we've got to be forbearing with one another and so forth. It's not, it's where when a vital truth of the gospel is at stake, or a vital truth in something where there has been a true moral lapse, and you just can't let that go. Okay. You just cannot do it. And listen to your conscience. Paul talks a lot about the conscience, and he'll talk about serving the Lord with a pure conscience. When I see that, I just shake my head going, wow, I wish I could do that, But we do have to listen to the conscience, well informed. Make sure, I think it's a very clear situation. If it's just you're hearing it secondhand and all these things, no. You've got to really know the facts of what you're talking about. And you just have to, again, can you look yourself in the mirror? What's more important to you? The cause of truth, Paul talks about doing all things for the sake of the gospel. Is that what's important to you, or is your job, the money you're making, and so forth? These are difficult things, and they're not easy, and there's a price you're going to pay probably. But trust in the Lord. He will be with you. And yeah, you're going to go through some tough days. You are. I still remember Coppinger saying to me, in a year from now, you'll be very happy where you are. And he was right. Matter of fact, it was even before then. He was absolutely right. And the Lord is faithful to us. We're not always very faithful to him, but he was very faithful to me. And I can't praise him enough for what he has done. And again, the ministries and the opportunities he's given me is still like, people will call me up and would you do this? Would you do that? All kinds of things. And so the Lord is just, he's very good to me, and I don't deserve it, but by his grace, he has, he's helped me and through the difficult times, and I give him the praise and the glory. And again, without him, there's no way I'd have done this. No way. Ultimately, the Lord, has to, through the power of the Lord, you can do these things. And again, in a church situation, as much as possible, let's live peaceably not just in the church, but out of the church. But again, when there's an essential truth of morality, a central truth of the gospel at stake, at that time, we cannot just, sort of ignore it or look aside. We have to stand and say, this is not right, and be willing to pay whatever price we have to pay.
Brother, your story is encouraging to me. I'm thankful that you have stood up and you did speak out. I imagine, and this could be a whole nother episode, we won't go into it, that the seminary has made at least external changes about the critical race stuff. But you have been helpful for many people to hear your story and to know, well, we got to be careful where we send our children and
Very much
our
so.
students.
And by the way, I used to get phone calls, even from parents at Southern Seminary. They would call me after I got fired, and people knew who I was. And I remember one lady saying, I've been trying to talk to Al Mohler for 3 months. He won't talk to me. I ask you to talk to me. We're talking within 24 hours. And she started telling me about how her son got corrupted by Jarvis Williams. And she started dropping these names that only, N.T. Wright. She wouldn't know those names. She's dropping all these names of what he's being taught in the critical race theory. And she's just distraught that Jarvis, destroyed her son. And Mohler won't even speak to her.
Well, may the Lord give repentance to him.
Yep.
and to
Yep.
And there are many, I think, people that I know that have gone to Southern that I really trust and love. And so, again, I'm thankful for my time there, but I am disheartened to hear exactly what happened to you and others. So, but I am encouraged by your time with us and the counsel you gave. Like, not everything is time to blow up the system time.
That's right.
But there are times when you do have to stand and say, I can't stand here I am. I'm standing.
That's right.
I forgot Martin Luther's thing. That's what I was about
That's
to
right. That's
say.
right. I heard it. I heard it though.
Okay.
I can do no other.
Yeah. Here I stand. I can do no other. There we go. Well, thank you again for coming on. God bless you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Brothers, you just heard the story of a man who chose the narrow path. Dr. Russell Fuller stood firm, not because it was easy, but because it was the right thing to do. He stood when others bowed. He spoke truth when others played politics, and in the end, he bore the cost of faithfulness. Scripture tells us in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12, indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Now, that's not just speaking about possibilities. That's really a promise. And yet, we're not left without hope. The same God who shut the mouths of lions and walked with men in the fire walks with us now. The Apostle Paul, facing abandonment and trial, wrote, at my first defense, no one came to stand by me, but all deserted me. But the Lord stood by me and strengthened me. Brothers, the Lord will stand by you too. When the pressures to compromise comes, when your job, your church, or your reputation is at stake, remember who you belong to. You were bought with a price. The blood of Christ was not shed so you could play it safe. It was shed to redeem you, to cleanse you, and to make you bold. Not in your own strength, but in His. We live in a time when even churches lose their way, sadly. When men trained in truth trade it for applause. When seminaries, once bastions of orthodoxy, become platforms for error. And it can feel disorienting. But Christ is still building His church. And the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So what do? Well, you fix your eyes on Jesus, the author, perfecter of our faith. You dig deep into the Word. You speak truth with gentleness and clarity. Lead your family with love and labor in your church with courage. And if you fall, get up. If you're afraid, pray for strength. If you've been silent, start speaking. This world needs faithful men who tremble at God's word, not at the opinions of the crowd. Men who love Christ more than comfort. Men who live by Romans 1:16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. The gospel of Christ is not compatible with the ideologies of this age. It doesn't need to be updated, nuanced, or filtered through the lens of man-made theories. It just simply needs to be proclaimed in love, lived out in holiness, and trusted with your whole heart. So take courage, brothers. Stand firm. And remember, you're not alone. Christ is with you, and his promises are sure. Now, if this episode strengthened you, subscribe to the podcast. Share it with another man who needs the truth and he needs encouragement. And then stay in the fight. And so, until next time, build, fight, protect, and lead. This is the Patriarchy.